You know the line. We can all picture it, right? Some epic Hollywood scene, the Colosseum packed, and fighters all shouting this in unison before a massive, bloody free-for-all. It's an image we all know. But is that really how it went down? Was it just this disorganized brawl? Did they just toss a bunch of people into a pit with random weapons and hope for the best? Well, the truth is actually way, way more fascinating. See, what we were really looking at was a super-regulated, high-stakes sport. You gotta think of it less like a riot and more like modern prize fighting. There were specific classes, there were referees, there were strict rules, and most importantly, there were these incredible, carefully crafted matchups designed for pure entertainment. So where did all these different fighter types even come from? Well, in the beginning, they came straight from the battlefield. The very first gladiator styles were actually based on the enemies Rome had fought and conquered. Let's start with the OG, the Samnite. This guy was one of the original heavyweights, and he was kitted out exactly like the Samnite warriors Rome spent decades fighting. He had that big, rectangular shield, the scutum, and the iconic Roman short sword, the gladius. In fact, that's where the word gladiator comes from. And here's where you can see just how tied the arena was to real-world politics. Eventually, Rome made peace with the Samnites, and they became allies, even Roman citizens. Suddenly, it was, well, kind of awkward and politically incorrect to have them as the bad guys in the arena. So the Samnite class was retired, and the style evolved into a new heavyweight called the Murmillo. Same gear, different name. Problem solved. And that brings us to the real genius of the games, the pairings. The organizers knew that to make a fight exciting, you needed a clash of styles. They wouldn't just throw two identical fighters at each other. No, they created these deliberate mismatches in equipment. It was a deadly game of rock, paper, scissors, or maybe rock, paper, trident, where every fighter had a specific strength and a specific weakness. A perfect example of this was the Murmillo versus the Thraex. The Murmillo, nicknamed the Fishman, was a walking fortress hiding behind that giant shield. So how do you beat that? You give his opponent, the Thraex, a much smaller shield for agility, but you also give him a wicked curved sword called a sicca. Now that curve wasn't just for show, it was engineered to get around the edge of that big shield and land a hit. It was the classic matchup, pure power versus speed and technique. But honestly, the most iconic, most bizarre matchup of all time has to be the Retiarius versus the Secutor. The Retiarius, the net fighter, was basically dressed as a fisherman. He had almost no armor, just a trident, a dagger, and a weighted net. His opponent, the Secutor, or pursuer, was a heavily armored tank. But, and this is brilliant, his helmet was perfectly smooth and rounded, with only tiny little eye holes. Why? To keep the net from snagging on it. It was the ultimate game of cat and mouse. And you could practically hear the Retiarius taunting him, "It's not you I'm after, it's your fish." You know, after a few hundred years of these games, the crowd started to want something new, something different. So to keep things fresh, the organizers started bringing in all sorts of specialist fighters. And some of them were, well, just plain weird. For starters, you had mounted combat. The equites would ride in on horseback, often as the opening act. They'd start their fight with lances and then dramatically leap off their horses to finish the duel with swords. And if that wasn't enough, you had the Essedari, who fought from actual war chariots, a style inspired by the Celtic warriors that Julius Caesar wrote about fighting in Britain. Then you had the guys with the really crazy weapons. Get this, the Dimacharius fought with two swords at once. No shield, just pure, relentless offense. Imagine the skill that took. Or how about the scissor? This guy had a tube on his forearm with a half-moon blade on the end, perfect for slicing up nets or even getting through gaps in armor. And if a net wasn't your style, you could be a Locawarius, who used a lasso to try and rope his opponent. And just when you think it can't get any stranger, you get the Andabate. These guys fought completely blind. They wore helmets with no eye holes and would just charge at each other on horseback, basically relying on hearing and pure luck. It must have been absolute chaos. And finally, if one-on-one fights got a little stale, they just sent in the Catervari, who fought in huge, messy team brawls. Okay, this next part is so important to understand because it's probably the biggest misconception out there. Not everybody who set foot in that arena was a gladiator, not even close. This chart lays it out perfectly. At the top, you have the gladiator. This is your professional athlete, a highly trained, incredibly valuable asset who could be a slave, sure, but could also be a volunteer. They had a real shot at winning money, fame, and even their freedom. Then you had the venator, or beast hunter. These were trained specialists, but their job was to fight animals, not other people. And at the absolute bottom of the pile, you had the Noxi. These were condemned criminals. No training, bad weapons, thrown into the arena purely for public execution, often by being fed to wild animals. That was a sentence called damnatio ad bestias, and there was no coming back from it. So, when you piece all of this together, a totally different picture of the games emerges. It wasn't just a mindless bloodbath. There was a code, a complex system behind the whole thing. You have to remember, these gladiators were a massive financial investment. Their owners, the Lanistae, spent a fortune training them, feeding them, and giving them medical care. So while the fates were absolutely brutal, killing your opponent wasn't always the point. A skilled fighter who lost a good match would often be granted missio, mercy, so he could live to fight and earn another day. At the end of the day, it was a business. And I've got one last detail for you that completely shatters the typical image. Not all gladiators were men. It was rare and definitely controversial at the time, but female gladiators called gladiatrices absolutely existed. We even have a famous carving that shows two of them, nicknamed Amazonia and Achalia, who fought so well against each other that the fight was declared a draw and both were granted their freedom. So that leaves us with this one big, fascinating question. The Romans didn't just like violence, they organized it. They turned it into a complex sport with 1,000 rules and regulations. What does it tell you about a society when its biggest form of entertainment is a highly structured, rule-bound system for spectacular death? It says a lot, that's for sure. It speaks to a culture that was obsessed with order, discipline, and the art of the fight.